In the summer of 1984, I lived and worked in London through a labor exchange agreement between the governments of the United States and the United Kingdom. I worked at a restaurant in Covent Garden, London's theater district, and I resided in the Hackney neighborhood in the East End. In order to make my way to work every day, I took a bus. One day, I was riding the bus, and at one of the stops, two young men about my own age entered the bus. They were both tall, pallid, in a way that only British people could be pallid, wore torn blue jeans with chain loops and black leather jackets, had piercings. One had a green mohawk, the other had a blue mohawk. Neither looked as if he had had a bath much lately. Even though I went to school in Athens, Georgia, and people who were punk rockers like them were fairly common there, then those punks in London looked kind of scary. At the next stop, an elderly woman with a cane, probably someone in her 80s, walked to the bus, up to the bus, and struggled to climb up. She just couldn't lift her leg high enough. The two punks got out of their seats and silently helped the woman board the bus. She sat down at the front of the bus, and the fellows found empty seats behind her, further down the bus. I was stunned at what happened. No words had been exchanged, no riders reacted to this moment. Everything had just happened normally. The people on the bus seemed unfazed by the interaction. It struck me first that I had judged the young men unfairly, and I felt ashamed of my presumption. Despite appearing antisocial and violent, they were clearly responsible and generous. I also observed that it was inconceivable that something like that would have happened in the United States. Our basic assumption is that helping that woman aboard the bus was the responsibility of the bus driver, not the fellow passengers. The most significant learning, though, was that kindness to strangers, the elderly, the weak, was expected of ordinary people. Had something like that happened in the United States, people would have smiled and said grateful words to those young men. Aren't they good? Kindness to strangers, though, was something taken for granted. If you ask the British, they will tell you that they are not particularly kind to each other. They take for granted sometimes the forms of kindness that are normally expected. I felt sad for my country that day, that caring for each other, practicing kindness, was just not expected in the same way. Kindness is an important value for us as individuals, as a community, and as a nation. Kindness can be understood in many different ways, and certainly Unitarian Universalists use their own definitions of words and concepts. Each of us can define a concept in one's own context or belief system. After all, the word God holds entirely different meanings within Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Sikhism, Islam, Jainism, humanism, atheism, neo-paganism, and Zoroastrianism. Indeed, under those umbrellas are many different definitions of the word God, even in the same religious communities. So what does kindness mean? The definition that seemed most useful to me is kindness is the quality of being friendly, generous, and considerate. Kindness is the quality of being friendly, generous, and considerate. Being kind is not as complicated as one might imagine. Being kind in this way is embodied in every major religion. And we might argue that every world religion has transgressed being friendly, generous, and considerate at times. The practice of religion is often at odds with the ideals that the religion proclaims. Certainly, every religion has its own version of the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And every religion has historically missed the mark at times. Sometimes that happens in every community. When unkindness happens in a faith community, it can be truly challenging. It happens in every faith community in one way or another, but most faith communities are made up of people who are truly kind to each other. Most faith communities are full of people who want to be friendly, generous, and considerate. Most Unitarian Universalist congregations are that way, most of the time. Some of the congregations founded between the end of World War II and 1967 as fellowships have a history of challenges with kindness. They were founded at a time when our religious movement was under the sway of religious humanism, which was formed from a belief in reason and science. At that time, religious humanism was the faith of modernism. Most of the fellowships were basically humanist societies. Fellowships were Unitarian and then Unitarian Universalist congregations that did not have ministers. After World War II, our religious movement experienced extraordinary growth in numbers, and there were not enough ministers to serve the newly founded fellowships, and most were too small to sustain a minister anyway. Most grew to have disdain for clergy, though, and for organization in general. Being influenced powerfully by science, they sometimes saw their communities as places to explore scientific ideas and to form their ethical values from scientific methodology. Science is not always merciful. In science, an idea or theory is either right or wrong. Scientists are chastened by their mistakes. Every aspect of things is to be analyzed and critiqued. The scientific community has probably changed, but that's the way things were back then. Using this mindset, some of the people in fellowships believed that it was more important to be right than it was to be kind all the time. When applied to congregational life, modernism was difficult. Fellowships were often contentious communities with hardly any rules or codes of conduct. They could be places where strong personalities overwhelmed or drove out those who were seeking a more peaceful community. They could be challenging places. Congregations that started as fellowships often had problems working with each other and with ministers. It is difficult to adjust to working with a spiritual leader and create order when a certain anarchy had prevailed and was part of the fellowship's culture. The strong personalities who had prevailed over community life also did not like sharing power with clergy. Most of the fellowships did not survive to the stage where they grew large enough to call a minister, though. 80% of them dissolved before they could grow large enough to call a minister or become what we would call a church, I guess. Most never attained more than 40 members because growing much larger than that would have required a higher degree of organization, setting boundaries, and dealing with strong personalities. Congratulations! Your congregation made it out of the fellowship movement and became a church. You became a community that values kindness, even though it is sometimes imperfect in practicing it together. You value kindness so ardently that of the 3 points of your mission that were recited today, connecting in kindness is one of the aspirations that you hope to practice and attain in your life together and in the larger community. That is a great goal. Connecting in kindness is not a simple thing, though. It does not mean that you will not have conflict. It does not mean that differences do not exist. It does not mean that someone will not hurt or offend you. We, being human, will always be vulnerable to that in community. And in whatever Unitarian Universalist congregation or other religious community you might join, you will find at least one person who will get on your last nerve. I have served, worked for, or been a member of 18 Unitarian Universalist congregations. Be grateful if there is only one person. If your encounters with someone are intense and troubling, share your perceptions with the other person. This congregation's covenant encourages you to empower one another to remind us, each of you, when your actions fall short of our ideals. This means at time you will be the one reminding someone that that person has not lived the covenant. It might also mean that you might be the person who has not lived the covenant well yourself. If trying to reach out garners no response, then contact the Committee on Shared Ministry. You have provided yourself with resources for connecting in kindness in this community and for improving communication. As said before, kindness is the quality of being friendly, generous, and considerate. Being kind does not come easily to a church. It's a place where we come to be our best selves, to love and to be loved. It's a community in which we share our love and our deepest hope for each other and the larger world. But it isn't easy. It takes time to heal the wounds that one feels from harsh words or actions that go deep into your spirit. When faced with unkindness, one might ask, why was that person unkind? How might I react unkindly? How might I be more generous or considerate? How might I connect? One of the more difficult things to do, to live in kindness, is just let an inconsiderate word or act slide off. This means forgiving, and that is a spiritual discipline in itself. For Christians, this is supposed to be a form of kindness, yet it is one that should not be practiced all the time, because the spiritual depth is not always there for all of us. Yet sometimes forgiving someone is necessary and possible. And even though most of us probably do not consider ourselves Christians, there is an example of forgiveness in that narrative. Gratitude is another way to practice kindness. Be thankful to others for kindness, even when it is not kindness that you have personally received. Are you thankful for the social justice project? Was the coffee especially good? Did you receive cards from other congregants? Just thanking someone or your community is a kind act. Gratitude needs to be focused. If someone has performed extraordinary service to the congregation, that contribution should be acknowledged. Gratitude is one of the ways that demonstrates kindness and connection. Clarity is also a way of being kind, Brene Brown has stated that being clear is kind, unclear is unkind. She writes, feeding people half-truths or nonsense to make them feel better, which is almost always about making ourselves feel more comfortable, is unkind. Not getting clear with someone about your expectations because it feels too hard, yet holding them accountable or blaming them for not delivering is unkind. Brene Brown writes about leadership in this regard, but she says that it's also true that being clear applies to other sorts of relationships and situations. I would suggest that being clear often applies to living in a church as well. This is a perspective that is difficult to wrap my brain around. It means engaging in a good downloading that is respectful but direct. Brene Brown calls it a rumble. Don't worry, there are no switchblades involved. Rather, Brene Brown writes that a rumble is a discussion, conversation, or meeting defined by a commitment to lean into vulnerability, to stay curious and generous, to stick with the messy middle of problem identification and solving, to take a break and circle back when necessary, to be fearless in owning our parts, and, as psychologist Harriet Lerner teaches us, to listen with the same passion with which we want to be heard. What she means is having a real conversation. As a member or friend of the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Lehigh Valley, you are covenanted to rumble, to listen with the same passion with which you want to be heard. Real conversations are not simple things, and they always involve a degree of vulnerability. Who of us wants to hear that we have been unkind or any number of things? None of us. But some of us are. Well, all of us are at some time. Yet by being clear with each other, we learn something about ourselves and grow in relationship. Being vulnerable is complicated when someone has a personal history of neglect or abuse. It is no simple thing then, and it can be a point of personal and even spiritual growth. Trust can be created by real conversation. Trust is also created by small acts of kindness. It is not always the major acts of kindness that establish trust, but the small ones usually do. Thinking about someone's needs and responding, even if those are small acts, creates trust over time. These are just some of the ways that we can be kinder to one another, forgiving, being grateful, and being clear. Kindness is a spiritual value to us. Being kinder is something that you have voiced a desire to work on. As your developmental minister, I'm here to help you in that regard. There is an enigma to me about this congregation. I do not perceive this congregation as unkind. Even after being with you for about a year and a half, I do not perceive this congregation as being unkind. Inconsiderate, rude, thoughtless. Yes, sometimes we are. You do all, after all, reside in the Northeast region of the United States, an area not always known for being considerate, friendly, or generous. If some of that seeps into the congregation, then it is regrettable, and it is something that one encounters often in this region. In other words, sometimes it might be easy to forget that church is special. Church is love. We ought not to take the behaviors we encounter on the highway into the church. In a sense, the church exists to stand against the callousness of the dominant culture, to be a community of caring that models the world we want to live in. And I believe in many ways that this congregation is very kind. I have served congregations that were intensely unkind to each other, where the members and friends were. I know what that is like. Sometimes that happens. A colleague of mine serves a Unitarian Universalist church that sporadically wages war against itself. That colleague has printed up T-shirts for members to wear when they come to church. The T-shirts have the words, "Be kind," on them, to remind people to be kind to each other. Fortunately, this congregation is not like that now, though I have heard it's had its moments. The enigma is that something has happened or is happening that I do not understand or I'm not aware of. Maybe you act unkindly and do not talk about it. Maybe you are plotting the great unkindness. I cannot tell what it is that makes you feel unkindness. You'll have to tell me. We will be having a gathering after the service on March 10th to talk about living in kindness. Our success in this developmental task of assessing kindness and connection, and also working on the issue, is dependent upon your participation. I need to understand who you are in order to help you connect more fully in kindness. The last part of your enigma is, though, that you are concerned about kindness. I think you are a kinder congregation in many ways than are obvious to you. Your pastoral care to one another is greater than the majority of the congregations I have previously served. In fact, I can only think of one other that may have been better at it than you are. You provide rides to each other. You visit each other when needed. You hold one another when you are hurting. You listen when someone is sad. You send cards. You make calls. You send texts and emails. All of this is kindness. Can't you tell? You're involved in social action. Social action is about creating kindness in our local community and in the larger community. It's about providing food for the hungry, home for the homeless, haven for those facing violence and rejection, and peace for those facing war and injustice. This is the second most social action involved Unitarian Universalist congregation with which I have been affiliated. Isn't that a way of kindness made manifest? The Dalai Lama connected social action and kindness when he wrote, "When we feel love and kindness toward others, it not only makes makes others feel loved and cared for, but it helps us also to develop inner happiness and peace. And there are ways in which we can consciously work to develop feelings of love and kindness. For some of us, the most effective way to do so, though, is through religious practices. For others, it may be non-religious practices. What is important is that we each make a sincere effort to take seriously our responsibility for each other and for the natural environment. Your devotion to social justice is a form of kindness, one which you extend to the Lehigh Valley, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and the world. Working for justice is a form of kindness. In closing, the first principle of the Unitarian Universalist Association affirms and promotes the inherent worth and dignity of every person. We are right to apply this to everyone on this planet. It begins with us. Here in this church, and this congregation has a great heart. Obviously, there is work to be done. There is no denying that. We will explore what that might mean later on. This is a spiritual community of people who want to connect in kindness. May we be filled with loving kindness. May we be whole. So be it. Blessed be. Amen.